Welcome to the Generous Business Owner Podcast, where business owners gain inspiration and encouragement to live a legacy, not just leave one. And now your hosts, Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. My name is Jeff Thomas, and we have a very special guest with us today, Brent Dusing, who, if that name rings a bell and you are a frequent Generous Business Owner Podcast listener, that name does ring a bell. You're not wrong. We've done this is the second podcast we've done with Brent. We did one on really his story, and he is the founder and CEO of TruPlay, which is basically a gaming company, a Christian gaming company for young people. It's really amazing. Check it out. But we're not going to talk that much about his story today. That's already there. Go back and listen to that because it is a cool story. But this podcast. We're going to talk about kind of the structure of Brent's company, TruPlay, and the things he's learned along the way. We're getting a lot of questions from generous business owners on how are other people structuring their businesses. And Brent has a very unique structure, and I'm going to play dumb because I am dumb, okay? And I'm going to ask him a bunch of questions. But Brent, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Jeff. Well, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, thanks. Now, this is going to be fun. Okay, so introduce this topic of a benefit corp. Not a lot of people have it. I think it's not a very well-known sort of structure. What is this thing?
Yeah, so a benefit corporation is a legal designation in at least 34 states, including the state of Texas and the state of California, where you are a for-profit, which we are at TruPlay, but you file with your charter agreement that you file with the state that you have other public benefits. And those public benefits, as at least in Texas state law and in most states, can be one of the following. It can be an educational benefit, a social benefit, an environmental benefit, or a religious benefit. And so you can choose which of those you want to designate your company as. And the reason you do that, because again, you are for profit, and I'll get the bad news out of the way in the first minute of this podcast. Right. It doesn't save you any money on taxes. So if you're looking for tax, strategies or sheltering strategies, this is not the podcast for you. But if your business has a purpose, and look, Jeff's a friend, and I'm quite familiar with Arcos and the great work you guys do, and a lot of what Arcos, what you guys do at Arcos is try to help Christian business leaders, not just steward their wealth for wealth preservation, which you do, but also for purpose, for kingdom building, for purposes of generosity. And so if that's something you're interested in, then this is probably a good conversation for you to listen to. So what the Benefit Corp does is it gives you alignment with your employees, you might have investors, potentially even with your vendors, that this is the purpose of your business. Because legally, the definition of any business would be to maximize shareholder profits. You might be able to say, well, we also want to maximize employee well-being. Fine. What this is saying is, in addition to those two goals, though, we're providing a public benefit, right? So there are, as I mentioned, there's 4 categories. We can get more into that, but maybe I'll pause there, and if you have any questions to start out.
Yeah. How long, and I'm going to ask you some questions you may not know the answer to because I know you're not a lawyer, you're just executing on this, but how long do you think this has been around?
I know that in Texas it's been around for over 10 years.
Okay. I mean, really in the scope of things, that's not that long, frankly.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So it's not that surprising that, even people like me have heard of it, but I'm not an expert in it. The other thing is, I find it interesting that that religion is on the list. From anything from the government, it seems like they're allergic to anything that says religion at all. What's your sort of take on that?
My take on it is the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not yet overcome it. So, every now and then, every now and then as a Christian, you get a little bit of a benefit from the government. It doesn't happen very often. It might be like a shooting star. It might just be a fleeting moment in the night. But no, jokes aside, I do think that God did a lot of work for this to happen. And in fact, this is something Greg Abbott's office passed in Texas. I'll tell you a cool God story. I won't share who, but he had a staffer who worked for him that helped get this approved because there was a lot of resistance. So again, for context, right, it can be environmental, social, educational, or religious. And so some of those benefits, right, especially around environmental and social, are often defined in what you would think of a politically left context.
Yeah.
So when it was getting approved in Texas, there was hesitation around, this is just something to push, DEI or ESG.
Woke agendas.
And there are companies who use it for that, to be clear.
Yeah, of course.
But when it got approved in Texas, having a religious clause has helped business owners who have a Christian principle, who have kingdom principles, that want to have that come out inside their business for that to be able to be done. And so there was a gentleman who was a staffer for Greg Abbott, and he saw it through that lens. There was a lot of resistance, in other words. And, as you know, if you're listening, I'm sure you're aware, Texas has a Republican legislature and, Republican executives in terms of governor and lieutenant governor. So the likelihood that this was going to get passed a few years back was slim. Somebody who worked for Greg Abbott's office took a look and said, no, I think it's a way for also those who have strong, faith convictions to be able to operate their business with some freedom. And it wound up getting passed, even though there were certain conservatives who were against it. So it was kind of put in a different light because, right, there is a faith component to it. Interestingly, and I'll tell you a little bit, the second part of the story is what TruPlay does, just for context. So at TruPlay, we created this very high quality entertainment platform for kids. You can check it out, go to TruPlayGames.com or check it out, TruPlay on the App Store. It's an app with really high quality games, really high quality comics, videos. Kids love it. In fact, they prefer it to certain secular alternatives, and it's done with excellence and beauty, but it also contains biblical truth. And that's our focus. Everything we do is and our benefit is to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ through high quality entertainment products. That's what we do as a company. So what's interesting is I just happened to meet that staffer years and years later after we had already set it up as a public benefit. So this got passed back in the back half of last decade. So say in the 20-teens, back half of the 20-teens. I founded TruPlay in 2020. We set it up as a benefit corp in 2020. I then met this gentleman about 18 months later at a social event. And we got to talking, and it turns out he had been the one to really drive the approval in Greg Abbott's office. And now so the fact that like God was working through that whole process and wound up, opening this door for us was certainly a big benefit. And so let me tell you, why would you want to do it? So here's a few things it does. It helps you get alignment with, for example, your employees, right? Because you can tell your employees, look, this is our purpose as a business. You don't have to have a certain, your religious faith is your own choice. But if you work here, you're acknowledging that this is the purpose of this business because we've filed a charter with the state of Texas. So you're acknowledging this is what this company's doing. All right. The second benefit is that as you're making content, in our case, or in other cases, you obviously various different types of businesses, there's certain principles you would and wouldn't do. I'll give you an example, right? If you ran a manufacturing company, I think most people, if they had the opportunity to save some money, but to dump, in so doing, by saving money, they're running a manufacturing business, to dump toxic chemicals in the river stream behind the office, if it costs more money to not dump the chemicals, they would choose to pay the money because they're going to want to do the right thing. They don't want to poison the environment, even though, say they could legally get away with it and they could save a little money. Most people, I would hope at least, would say, no, we'd rather, pay a little extra money, take it on the chin this time because it's doing the right thing. We don't want to poison people downstream. We don't want to kill a bunch of animals. Great. So in the same way, we're going to make choices, whatever your business might look like, that may not be down to the final nickel of cost savings because we think it's the right thing to do for a business. And now you could be running a loan, a payday loan business and say, hey, there's certain things we're just not willing to do. Or you may be running a real estate business, right? So there's certain, you run a real estate business. Hey, we're not gonna, you may not want to have marijuana companies as tenants. And hey, let's be honest. If we're only in business to make money, then we're going to do everything we're going to do to maximize the last dollar. But if you have a public benefit, which if I don't run a real estate business, but if I did, there's no way I would have a marijuana company as a client because I don't want to poison our kids. Right. I don't want to poison our society. I don't want people getting brain damage. And so we would say no, we would forego that revenue and we'd find another tenant. And if we have to trust God to find another tenant, then that's what we're going to do. And you may have similar, as prostitution is getting legalized in certain states, people may have to make hard choices about, hey, I'm not going to have a brothel as a real estate client. So some of these questions, now that what's right and what's wrong are getting blurred because our society has moved more and more and more away from the Bible. Right? The idea of what's right and what's wrong, now prostitutes are called sex workers. Now, drugs are legalized and they just let people do whatever they want. There's obviously, you can think about things like abortion clinics, right? So there's all types of choices that you may be forced to make as a business owner that may actually be against your values, but a more profitable choice. And by being a benefit corp, like I said, it can give you alignment with your employees. Hey, here's what we're doing. Here's what we're not doing. With your everyday choices and also with your shareholders, because you can tell them, for example, like there's certain people we're not going to sell this company to. I'll tell you right now, we're not going to sell TruPlay to the people that make Grand Theft Auto. Not that they'd want to buy us anyway, but if they came knocking on our door, like we're not interested in selling a company that's, uplifting children and giving children a sense of hope and identity in the truth of Christ. We're not interested in selling that to the same company that makes a game where you shoot police and beat up prostitutes and sell drugs. We're not going to do that. And if you're going to invest in TruPlay, you've got to be at peace with that decision because, we are here for this to be a great outcome, but we also know we're all going to have to stand in front of God one day and answer for our decisions. So those are hopefully some ideas as to why a benefit corp might benefit you.
That's a good starting point. Maybe let's back up and get a little bit since I'm an old recovering accountant, let's get a little bit nerdy on the process. What did the process look like? How hard is it? What's on the application? You know what I mean? Just sure. What does that process look like?
Yeah. So the process, you're going to need to have your corporate attorney do this.
Yeah.
You file it in your charter. You have to have your shareholders elect to approve that designation. So you can, if you've already incorporated your business, you can change it out, but you've got to have, shareholder votes. And I don't know. I'm not an attorney, thank God. So I'm not going to.
I'm not trying to give legal advice here.
No, this is not a legal advice podcast, nor am I qualified to do so. But the point is, if you get your corporate attorney involved, I can tell you it will require, again, filing your charter and certain shareholder approvals, but it's pretty straightforward and the cost is pretty light.
Okay. I mean, ballpark. What do you think it cost?
I think, just a few grand in legal fees.
So we're not talking 100 or whatever.
Not at all. Not even close.
And then, some of these restrictions that you talk about, like you're not going to sell to a certain kind of person, you're not going to do certain kind of content. Is that documented in there? Like what's the language that you used?
That's a great question. So what you do legally is you file your public benefit. You elect which of the four categories.
Okay. So you're checking one of those boxes.
And then you're filing, this is our public benefit, and you have a public benefit statement. And then that's filed in your charter with the state. So then that's something you can give to people. And now the interpretation thereof in terms of or the how you display that or when you display that is then up to you, right?
Right. And how long is that? Is that 7 pages? Is that a paragraph?
No, it's a paragraph.
Right.
Yeah.
So you just really describe the way you described it to us. Like, here's our product. Here's how we think is beneficial to kind of back up the box I checked.
Yeah, here's the public benefit that we're declaring. And I'll give you guys some interesting examples. So companies that you might have heard of that are public benefit corporations. So Patagonia, most people know them. They're a public benefit corporation because they have an environmental benefit. There's a company called Allbirds, which makes shoes.
Yeah.
They have a public benefit that I believe is environmental. You might have heard of a company called Lemonade. They make an AI,
Yeah.
they use AI rather to do home renters insurance. So what's interesting about them, they're a social benefit corporation, public benefit, but for the social aspect, but in an interesting way where when you pay your monthly premium to them, and then whatever there's a delta that's not used, for their overhead or for paying claims, you can decide what charity you donate that extra piece of your premium to. So that's their public benefit.
Oh,
Ben
that's
and
kind of
Jerry's,
cool.
famously, Ben and Jerry's has kind of had a famous story around, well, the executives only make so much and this and this and that. So they have a public benefit that I believe is environmental, and it has to do, again, I think they use recycled materials, and I think
Yeah.
again, back to my point, and again, you may agree with this, you may disagree with this. It doesn't really matter, but it's an instructive point, which is they say, hey, we're going to take extra costs on because to them, we're going to do the right thing and try to recycle materials rather than potentially cutting down more trees. So there's a lot of ways that it can go, and like I said, there's quite a few household name companies that are using the public benefit. It's just, I think in the Christian sphere, in the faith sphere, it's a newer concept for people to be adopting.
I feel like it's being underused in sort of our sphere, if you will. I haven't heard of that many people doing it, and so I'm really glad this is getting out there. One thing that I'm kind of thinking about, I think you and I've talked about this before, is kind of I'm a C12 member, kind of this Christian CEO group, and a very hot topic in those worlds is you know how overt you are with your faith inside the business, how you document in your corporate documents, kind of your mission, vision, values, and there's a constant churn of discussion. I mean, that we've had inside our company and that we've had with others about kind of how you, frankly, the word protection is one I wrote down. Like how do you protect yourself from these lawsuits? Now, of course, anybody can sue for whatever. I mean, okay, but for religious discrimination. So if you sort of have this documented, obviously you can't discriminate on who you hire and these sort of things. There's some basic EEOC things. But in terms of, how do you let everyone know kind of where you stand as a company? This seems like a really good thing to do if your business qualifies as a way to document that. How do you kind of think about protection, maybe, or that sort of topic?
I think that's right. I think it's a disclosure you can make. Most companies have things like employee handbooks or
Right.
employment agreements. Well, hey, like this is what we do as a company. This is our public benefit. Just so you're aware. So one thing people can't claim is that they were surprised. Hey, I didn't know that I
Right.
worked at this company
Right.
and nobody told me. Well, no, we did tell you because first of all, it's publicly filed with our charter, and secondly, it's here in the handbook. It's here in the manual. So that is something that is, from the sake of disclosure, from the sake of alignment. And look, and again, it's an honest conversation. If this isn't something that you believe in or that you disagree with or something you hate, probably should have that conversation early.
Right.
Probably should figure out if this is really something you want to do.
It just seems like total clarity. Um, and I get it also from, you know, you're in a pretty capital intensive business. I mean, it takes engineers and all of these kind of things to build these, your product. And so raising outside capital. So it's super clear. I like the way you said that too. Like if I'm an investor in TruPlay, it would be really obvious to me, right? I mean,
Yeah.
by doing this, I mean, you're talk about going public. So some people just struggle with, yeah, should we tell the world that we're kind of doing this? So this is a way to just be overt. Like
Yes.
you are telling the world this is what we do. So you need a real clarity of mission to
Yeah.
proclaim this, right?
That's right, Jeff. And I would say a lot of the reason, look, our society is falling apart. And I'm sure if you're listening to this podcast, I don't need to say a whole lot, but I mean, I'll give you a few statistics. Anxiety, suicide, depression rates are all-time highs for kids. Only 31% of kids believe in God. 2% of children have a biblical worldview. Less than half of Americans go to church for the first time in history. For the first time since the 1940s. So in most people's lived history, the first time in 80 years. You know, pornography exposure, the average, 80% of men looked at pornography last week. Marriage rates are way down from what they were a few, years ago. Drug use is up. I mean, I could go on and give a lot of depressing statistics to your listeners. But here's what I'm saying, why I'm saying all this. At least half the reason why things are that way is because leaders who are believers haven't stood up and said anything. And so if you're, Jeff, you've described a couple times now, well, you talking to people and they're wrestling with how overt and how public do they need to be? Well, there's people putting sexual content in movies and cartoons for kids. They're not shy to push their worldview. There's people in schools who want to, I don't know if you know who John Amanchuku was. I was on a phone call with him just yesterday, and he was describing, I didn't even know this. He was describing there's some book read in a lot of schools that describes an incestual relationship between a father and his daughter that's like promoted as a good thing that's being read in elementary schools. And he stands up at a school board and he's the one who gets escorted out. So my point is, I'm giving a lot of examples, but my point to you all is it's that old Mother Teresa thing. If you got to be the change in the world you want to see. I mean, that may sound trite, but it's the truth. Jesus talked about that. He said, we're all going to have to stand in front of God and account for our actions. His brother, James, right, in the book of James, faith without works is dead. So, the least you can do is state your values and try to live them out. And frankly, if we had been doing that as leaders, and especially, Christian leaders, Christian men, had just been standing up and acting like you're supposed to act, half these problems wouldn't be there because people wouldn't think it would be okay to push sexual messages on kids. People wouldn't think it would be okay to say, hey, let's legalize drugs and put them in strip malls where everybody can go in. You can walk in, people wouldn't even think to do that because there'd be too much social pressure against it. So I would encourage people, if you're listening, be bold about your faith. Jesus told us to.
It's really interesting. You mentioned Patagonia, and we recorded a podcast like this, sort of in this series. I know they're not all the same, but it's sort of a loose series on the structure of businesses, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we had Pete Oakes on, and
I
same
love
thing.
Pete. He's a great guy.
Great
guy.
So Pete, right? He runs we took a bunch of guys, manufacturing business in a prison. We went up to Wichita and went in the prison and saw the whole. It's actually one of the most amazing experiences I've had. I mean, it was like a mission trip on U.S. soil, and then you're kind of going in. Maybe we can love on the prisoners, and they're like praying for us because he started a seminary in there. They've graduated. They're praying for us, and I'm like, what? It was amazing. Anyway, what he's done structurally is taken the Patagonia sort of estate plan. Okay, so they're doing the benefit corp as you described. That makes sense. And then they're using this estate plan thing. So because they've stated it so clearly as a benefit corp, now it's kind of come together, right? They've used both what you're doing, and then Pete's taken what they've done on the estate side, where they've given the business to a trust to avoid the estate tax. That is a tax strategy where they avoid it. This purpose trust is what it's called. I call it the Oaks Trust because he's kind of taken it and made it, for his purpose, just like you've taken the benefit corp and used it for religious purpose. He's done the same thing with the purpose trust.
Yes.
But that is a translation. Yes. So I can see, more companies like yours. And I think what it's forcing even me to do is go, okay, well, if I filed, what would I say? What is the public benefit of ARCOS? I think it's actually an interesting exercise.
It is.
As opposed to kind of what we do marketing or, branding, yes, or, our product. If you had to say, so I think that's an interesting exercise for me to do, for anybody running on the treadmill listening to this. If you had to write your one paragraph and check that box,
yes, what
would your paragraph say? I think that's an interesting challenge. Do you think that's a valid thought?
You're absolutely right, Jeff. The ability, one of the, so I happen to know, it kind of, there's clarity that comes in writing, right?
Yeah.
So there's a pastor that I used to spend some time with named Alistair Begg. You might have heard him on the radio. Brilliant speaker, one of the best public speakers you'll ever hear in your life. And spoke to him about public speaking, and one of his principles is, write yourself clear. You think in
Yeah.
your mind
Yeah.
that you got it all figured out, and then when you try to articulate it, you find that maybe the answers aren't quite as clear as you would assume they were because you're trying to put, thought to paper. So I think you're absolutely right. And how do you kind of condense down what you stand for, what your public benefit is, what your purpose is, why you're here? Those are, just like you would write your mission statement. Those are important things, especially because people who don't know you or who that will never have a chance to hear it directly from you, if you've got a big organization, you might not know all your employees. Those are things that you need to take the time to be able to articulate. And you'll find growth in the process.
I kind of frankly, forgive me, but I was kind of thinking that the primary benefit here was almost marketing. I mean, I don't mean it in a bad way. Marketing's necessary. But marketing and investment, hey, let's just make it clear. Not, I don't mean it as a negative, but I just like just sort of clarity for constituents, vendors, employees, like everybody. It's just clear. Like I like the clarity alone has value to me. Okay. But I hadn't thought about it sort of being a public stand. I really like what you said about that, where, you know, sort of your peers, if you will. I call it a gaming company. It's really an entertainment company, but like your peers at like the Wonder Project and other places that are doing House of David and those kind of things. Uh, they talk about the fact that Hollywood, for example, your industry as well, on the kind of the gaming and entertainment, but Hollywood, the Christians kind of ran away. They sort of gave the ground over to people that don't share their values. And we can all see the content that got produced. It's not pretty,
That's right.
right? I mean, same thing. So just sort of taking the ground back a little bit
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
really going public, not in terms of selling your stock to the public, but in terms of your filings and just being overt and writing that paragraph and then filing it. If it doesn't cost a fortune, what are you afraid of?
Yeah.
Making yourself a target? Is that the worst thing? It could be a positive target too, a light.
Yeah.
So anyway, how do you think about worrying about that? But
the great 21st century philosopher Brock Lesnar said 85% of the crap that you worry about never happens anyway. And by the way, if you don't know who that is, he was a former UFC heavyweight champion in the world and one of the greatest athletic specimens I've ever seen. I saw him fight twice. It's true, though. You can make up all these things in your head and the what ifs, but people forget the number one thing Jesus admonishes people to do is do not fear.
Yeah.
So you're going to stand up for your faith. Let's not forget. I think Christians, again, I listed a litany of all these problems that are wrong with our society today. And I think a lot of it's because Christians are too deep into their own comfort zone. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at the Jesus and the 12, okay, Judas hung himself and John died in prison. The other 10, including Jesus, so that's 11, 10 plus 1, were executed by the government for proclaiming the divinity of Jesus Christ, whether they were in Rome or in Judea or in India or in Egypt. That's how every one of their stories ended. And had they not done that, had those 10 men, 12, well, I guess let's say 11, because forget about Judas. Had those 11 men not gone to different corners of the earth, we wouldn't have Christianity as it stands today. There was no plan B. It was those 11 guys. All right, go. Right? Now, there's Paul. You can add Paul to that too, but he also got killed by the Romans for proclaiming the divinity of Christ. So my point is, I think we've lived in this culture in America as Christians as well. I'm going to go to church. I'm not going to steal or kill. And but otherwise, Monday through Saturday, I'm not going to risk too much because it might offend somebody. Somebody might get upset. Hey, meanwhile, the very same people that are pushing sexual content on 5-year-olds, where there's books, movies, pornography, whether it's pushing drugs on young children or legalizing drugs, knowing that young kids are going to get exposure to that. or making hyper-violent content, they're not shy about their beliefs. They're not afraid to stand up and say, "Hey, here's what we think is right." There was all this, when Disney had all this that dispute they got into with DeSantis, right, in Florida, and he's like, "Hey, listen, we're going to pass a bill that's not going to allow sexual content taught to 5-year-old kids." And employees at Disney walked out in protest. My question is this: where were the Christians at Disney
Yeah.
when Disney's policy reversed, walking out? There were none. Where are the Christians? I know people, and if you're listening, I hope you're offended, who work at Google, who work at Netflix, who work at Disney, and they say they're Christians, and who work at Apple, that are pushing policies all the time, pushing content all the time, that's having massive deleterious effects on kids. And parents, they're not protesting, they're not walking out because they're scared. But yet, when it happens on the other side of the coin, those people are willing to go to the mattresses. Tells you something about faith, doesn't it? Tells you something about who holds what convictions.
Well, I think you make a great point about the importance of standing up. Frankly, regardless of whether you qualify or file for a benefit corp, regardless of whether that happens, just sort of waking up to the situation and standing up for your own beliefs, not shirking back, but standing up. And I think hopefully there is a trend, maybe moving that tide in a different direction, and that's part of what we're trying to highlight here. So this has really been great. Is there anybody who this is not for? Are there any, like, I think you've done a pretty good job illuminating like the kind of person that should do this. Is there? Can you think of cons or things that, I mean, obviously there can be cons if some people come at you, or people that shouldn't do it.
It's hard to say.
Right.
Sorry, I
Yeah, but just discern it. I think it's, some people maybe it's not going to be fit for everybody. I think that's okay.
And again, you may have, like you brought up Pete Oakes. That's someone who has an educational benefit, right, to one of his businesses because he's employing prisoners that is essentially giving them some job training. So, I think there's opportunities for those of you who are looking to have a greater purpose, for those of you who are looking to have greater impact, and discerning what God's called you to. But I do think this public benefit is an opportunity for business owners and entrepreneurs to really take to heart.
Up. I like it. It also struck me as you were talking about, I really like that backstory of how it got passed in Texas, for example. It kind of makes sense. Yeah. And because it sort of, your brain really wants to understand how that happened. Before we started recording, we were just kind of updating each other as friends. And the thing I was sharing with you was like the thing I'm obsessed with sort of on the financial side is, people kind of get jammed into a template in estate planning where they just give it all the kids and buy insurance to pay the estate tax. Well, that estate tax is optional. If you are a generous person, which most of our listeners are, that is optional. You can do all kinds. There are amazing things in the United States tax code, federal tax code, where you can literally eliminate that estate tax. So all legal. This is black and white stuff. Yeah. So I live in this world of being, hey, there are these opportunities. We still live in a free society. We got a lot of problems, but it's still one of the best out there. Okay. Sure. And you and I are free to say the name of Jesus on this podcast, all we want. Okay. Sure. So, and we actually have, you're talking about filing issues. There's actually this cool thing in most states that you could file as a benefit corp, as a structural thing. And there are amazing tax benefits. So I'm always like, why are we foregoing those? So I know this is one of your things. It's like, hey, take a look at this. Benefit corp, stand up, do it. Yeah. In sort of my financial world, I'm like, hey, take advantage of these tax breaks that are amazing for generous people. It's just nobody's promoting them. Right. Because people like me will have less to manage when you give it away. Who cares? That's not what I'm going to be accounted for. Like encouraging these flames of generosity and purpose as you are to just just be a full reflection of who God made you to be, and stand up and say it, do it in the structure, do it in the tax code, do it in your giving. Just do it everywhere. Do it everywhere in a winsome way.
Right. Amen.
I mean, I think it's beautiful, man. Well, I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. Is it okay? What's the best way for people to find you if they might have a question about this?
Gosh, we're on, you can go to TruPlayGames.com. We're
Okay.
on most social media channels, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. So,
Perfect.
yeah.
All right, man. Well, we'll be sure to put your website and
Yeah,
some
check
of those
out
links.
TruPlay, check out TruPlayGames.com.
Absolutely.
You can find us on the socials, and hopefully this is something that's a benefit if you're a listener. Thank you.
Hey, Brent, can't thank you enough for walking us through this. I think it's got a ton of value.
Thank you. Good being with you today.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. Subscribe, share it with a friend, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Generous Business Owner Podcast with Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt. Make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can find the guest contact information in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode.